My sister stared at the $5 million check in my hand as if I had walked into her bank carrying stolen diamonds. Then her mouth curled into the same contemptuous smile I had known since we were young. "There is no legitimate way someone like you gets access to this kind of money," Vanessa said loudly enough for half the lobby to hear. "Not unless you stole it." Before I could answer, she snatched the government check off the counter. My 8-year-old son, Ethan, froze beside me. Vanessa held the document up for the gathering crowd, tore it straight down the middle, ripped the halves again, and scattered the pieces over the marble floor at my feet. Then she pointed at me and shouted for security to call the police. "Arrest her. She's a fraud." I tightened my hand around Ethan's and stood perfectly still. I did not argue. I did not beg. I did not even bend down to pick up the shredded pieces lying across my worn combat boots. Vanessa thought she had just humiliated the poor military failure of the Dawson family. What she did not know was that her little performance had just put a classified $750 million Department of Defense contract in jeopardy. A contract powerful enough to determine whether the bank she worshipped would survive the year. And by the time she understood whose check she had destroyed, it would already be too late to undo what she had started. Before I tell you how that afternoon ended, take a second to like the video and subscribe if stories about dignity, family betrayal, and consequences mean something to you. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what happened inside that bank did not begin with a $5 million check. In some ways, it had begun years earlier, in a cramped house where another person I loved decided my uniform made me worthless. As the torn pieces of paper settled around my boots, the cold air of Crestmont National Bank disappeared from my awareness. For one sharp second, I was back in the little house where Ethan and I had once lived with his father, Daniel Mercer. I could smell dish soap and reheated coffee. I could hear the kitchen faucet running. I could see my old field jacket hanging over the back of a chair, while Daniel stood in the living room with a suitcase at his feet and his car keys already in his hand. He had spent months making smaller comments about my military career, about the hours, the deployments, the fact that I cared more about duty than appearances. That night, he stopped pretending his resentment was temporary. He pointed at my jacket and told me my devotion to the Marine Corps was nothing more than an excuse for failing financially. According to him, a woman who came home exhausted, drove an old truck, and wore the same boots for years had no business believing she was building a respectable life. I had been rinsing Ethan's cereal bowl when Daniel told me our son would eventually be embarrassed by me. He said Ethan deserved a mother who understood how the world really worked, someone who knew money was what gave people choices, influence, and respect. Then he admitted he had met someone in the city who could give him the kind of life he believed he deserved. Someone wealthy, someone connected, someone who did not measure every purchase or live around deployment schedules. I remember turning off the faucet and asking him one question. "Are you really leaving without saying goodbye to your son?" Daniel looked toward the hallway for half a second, where Ethan was asleep, with a stuffed dinosaur tucked under his arm. Then he looked away. He picked up his suitcase, opened the front door, and said Ethan would probably be better off learning not to expect much from him. The door slammed so hard that our framed wedding photograph fell from the wall and shattered across the floor. Vanessa had taken Daniel's side almost immediately. She told our parents I had driven him away by being impossible to live with. She said I had chosen the military over my marriage. She repeated his favorite accusation whenever the subject came up. I had wasted my life serving for a paycheck that could never compete with what successful people earned in the private world. Eventually, I stopped defending myself. There are arguments that become degrading simply because you continue participating in them. I had men and women under my command who depended on me to make sound decisions under pressure. I had a child who needed stability. I had no interest in wasting what little peace remained in my life, trying to persuade my sister that honor had value even when it did not come with a luxury car. Years passed, and I learned how to keep the important parts of my life quiet. In Pine Hollow, I was simply Claire Dawson, the single mother in the small wooden house near the edge of town. My neighbors saw me mowing my own yard on Saturday mornings, fixing loose boards on the porch, and hanging laundry outside when the weather was good. Ethan's teachers knew I traveled for government work, but I never discussed rank or responsibilities. Most people had no idea I was a full-bird colonel in the United States Marine Corps, or that I also served as a senior Department of Defense representative, coordinating enormous veteran housing and pension programs across 17 states. I preferred it that way. Secrecy was not about shame, it was about Ethan. I wanted him to understand people before he learned to categorize them by money or status. I did not want my rank to become his identity, and I did not want access to powerful people to become something he expected. I wanted him to say thank you to a grocery clerk with the same respect he would offer a general. I wanted him to know that a clean conscience mattered more than a polished watch, that keeping your word mattered more than owning the right car, and that real authority did not need to announce itself every time it entered a room. After watching Daniel leave in pursuit of money and seeing Vanessa build her entire personality around wealth, I had become determined that Ethan would not inherit the same sickness. That Tuesday afternoon was supposed to be ordinary. Ethan and I pulled into the parking lot of Crestmont National Bank's Ashford branch in my old pickup, surrounded by luxury SUVs, German sedans, and two sports cars that probably cost more than my house. Dust from the roads outside Pine Hollow coated the hood. The exhaust rattled for a few seconds after I shut off the engine. Ethan unbuckled himself, grabbed the backpack he refused to replace, and waited for me to come around to his side. The zipper was damaged, one strap had been repaired twice, and a friend from school had drawn a crooked dinosaur across the front with a permanent marker. Ethan considered it priceless. Our plan was simple. I needed to deposit a $5 million government check connected to a children's support program administered through the Department of Defense. After that, Ethan wanted to walk to the bookstore and spend the allowance he had been saving on a new stack of comics. Then we were going to stop at our favorite barbecue place outside town for pulled pork sandwiches and sweet potato fries. No ceremony, no escort, no special treatment, just paperwork, comic books, dinner, and home. The change in atmosphere was immediate when we entered the bank. The Ashford branch had been designed to make wealth feel permanent. Marble floors reflected the chandeliers. Frosted glass separated private consultation rooms from the main lobby. Everything smelled faintly of expensive coffee, polished stone, and somebody's heavy perfume. 3 tellers were talking behind the counter when Ethan and I stepped through the doors. Their conversation stopped long enough for them to look us over. Their eyes traveled from my faded olive cargo pants to my old jacket, then to Ethan's plain shirt and battered backpack. One teller's smile vanished. Another leaned toward her coworker and whispered something while glancing at my boots. I noticed. Of course I noticed. Years of military service train you to read a room before the room understands you are reading it. But I said nothing. A man in a tailored suit entered a few moments after us and was greeted by name before he reached the center of the lobby. An employee offered him coffee. A woman with a designer handbag was personally escorted toward a private office. Another customer barely had time to remove his sunglasses before someone appeared to ask how they could assist him. Ethan and I remained standing near the entrance without a single employee approaching. It was not confusion, it was judgment. I had seen the same kind of hierarchy in more dangerous places, where people made decisions about who mattered before hearing a single word from them. The difference was that I had never expected my son to encounter it so plainly in a bank lobby on a Tuesday afternoon. His fingers tightened around mine. We started toward the counter, but after several steps he stopped. He tugged on my sleeve until I looked down. His expression hurt more than anything Vanessa would later say to me. Ethan was not angry. He was confused, and children have a painful habit of assuming adults must have a reason for treating them badly. "Mom," he whispered, "did we do something wrong?" I crouched in front of him. He glanced toward the employees and then down at his backpack. "Is it because this looks old?" That question went through me like a blade. He was 8 years old, standing in a beautiful room full of adults, and already trying to identify what was wrong with himself so their contempt would make sense. I put both hands gently on his shoulders. "There is nothing wrong with your backpack, but they're nice to everybody else." "I know." "Then why?" "Listen to me." I brushed a strand of hair off his forehead and waited until he met my eyes. "You never decide what kind of person someone is before you know them, even if they do that to you. We came here to take care of something, and that's what we're going to do." He studied my face. "Okay. And that backpack stays until you decide you're done with it." That earned the smallest hint of a smile. I squeezed his shoulder, stood, and continued toward the counter with him beside me. I could feel the discipline of 20 years settling into my posture, shoulders squared, breathing even, attention focused. Inside my jacket, the official check was secured against a folder containing my military identification and Department of Defense authorization papers. To everyone watching, I looked like a tired mother in old clothes. I was perfectly comfortable allowing them to believe that. We were only a few feet from the transaction counter when a frosted glass office door opened. The sound was quiet, but I knew immediately who had stepped into the lobby. Vanessa Dawson looked exactly like the life she had spent years constructing. Her charcoal designer suit fit perfectly. Her hair had been shaped into a smooth, controlled wave that never seemed to move, even when she did. Her nails were painted a deep red, and her heels struck the marble with the crisp confidence of someone who believed every person in the building existed somewhere beneath her. Vanessa had been managing the Ashford branch long enough that the employees reacted to her presence before she spoke. Backs straightened. Conversation stopped. A security guard near the wall turned his attention toward her. Then she saw me. For a moment, I searched her face for something familiar. We had shared a bedroom when we were children. She used to braid my hair before school when our mother was running late. There had been nights when thunderstorms frightened us, and she climbed into my bed because she was too proud to admit she was scared. Those memories belonged to another lifetime. Her eyes moved over my clothing, my boots, Ethan's backpack, and finally my face. Whatever recognition existed there was buried instantly beneath embarrassment. She did not come forward like a sister surprised to see family. She approached like a manager, discovering something unpleasant in her lobby. I guided Ethan to the counter and rested one hand on the polished surface. Vanessa stopped on the opposite side. "Claire," she said. "Vanessa." Her gaze dropped toward Ethan. "You brought him here dressed like that." I felt Ethan shift closer to me. "We're here for a transaction," I said. Vanessa gave a short, humorless laugh. "At this branch?" "Yes." Something about my calmness irritated her. It always had. Vanessa understood emotional reactions because she knew how to use them. Silence made her uncertain. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and removed the government check. I unfolded it carefully, placed it flat on the counter, and slid it toward her. Vanessa glanced down. Her entire expression changed. $5 million. Her eyes moved across the amount once, then again. She checked my name. She looked at the government markings. For one brief second, surprise overwhelmed everything else. Then the surprise hardened into disbelief, and disbelief became something uglier. She looked up slowly. "Where did you get this?" "It's legitimate government funding." "That isn't what I asked." "I know exactly what you asked." Her voice rose. "Claire, where did you get $5 million? Several tellers turned toward us. I kept my voice level. "I need the check processed through the appropriate government verification procedure." Vanessa stared at me as though my answer itself were an insult. I watched years of resentment move across her face. In her version of our family story, she had made every correct choice. She had pursued money, prestige, and influence. I had chosen deployments, sacrifice, and a life she considered small. The possibility that I could walk into her domain, carrying something important enough to command serious attention did not merely surprise her. It offended the structure on which she had built her identity. She picked up the check and held it between two fingers. "This has to be fake." Ethan looked up at me. "It isn't," I said. Vanessa's laugh traveled farther across the lobby this time. "You expect me to believe that someone who drives that wreck outside and shows up looking like this legitimately has access to $5 million? The room grew quieter. I could already feel people listening. I reached inside my jacket again and placed my military identification beside the check. Then I added the official Department of Defense authorization documents, stamped and prepared for verification. "You don't have to believe anything," I told her. "You only have to do your job. Call the verification number on the authorization. The Treasury channel will confirm everything." Vanessa did not touch the papers. 2 minutes, I said. "That is all this needs." For one moment, there was still a path out. She could have picked up a phone. She could have handed the documents to an employee. She could have separated our history from her professional responsibility and discovered the truth before anyone else in the room knew there was a problem. Instead, Vanessa looked at my identification, then at me, and smiled. It was not the smile of a banker about to verify a transaction. It was the smile of a sister who had finally found an audience. Vanessa's smile lingered for 1 second too long, and that was when I understood she had already made her decision. She was not interested in verifying the check, understanding the transaction, or protecting the bank. She wanted to embarrass me in front of the people whose approval mattered to her, and the more calmly I stood there, the more determined she became to drag me down to the version of myself she had carried in her head for years. She tapped one crimson fingernail against my military identification, barely glancing at the Department of Defense authorization forms beside it, then lifted her eyes toward me with theatrical disbelief. "You seriously expect me to accept this?" she asked. A few official-looking papers, a military ID, and a check with more zeros than you've probably seen in your entire life. I kept my hands flat against the edge of the counter and reminded her that she did not need to accept anything on faith. The verification number was printed directly on the authorization paperwork. The bank had procedures for government instruments. All she had to do was follow them. I told her again that the entire matter could be confirmed in less than 2 minutes. But Vanessa had stopped listening before I finished. A young teller standing several stations away had been watching the exchange with growing unease. Her name badge read Rachel Carter. She looked to be in her mid-20s, with closely cropped dark hair, and the kind of alert expression that told me she was actually processing what was happening rather than waiting for Vanessa to tell her what to think. Rachel's eyes had gone immediately to my identification when I placed it on the counter. She recognized the rank markings. She also recognized the Department of Defense seals, and unlike the others around her, she seemed to understand that documents like these were not something a sane person casually fabricated in the middle of a federally regulated bank. She stepped away from her terminal and approached cautiously. "Dawson," she said to Vanessa, keeping her voice respectful, "I can take the paperwork to the verification room and make the call. It should only take a minute." She was not challenging anyone. She was offering the most ordinary solution available, the exact solution that should have ended the situation immediately. Vanessa turned toward her so quickly that Rachel stopped mid-step. "Excuse me?" she said. Rachel swallowed, but she did not retreat at once. She explained that her father had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before losing his left leg to a roadside bomb, and that she had grown up around military paperwork, benefits documents, and official correspondence. She was careful to say that she was not claiming the check was automatically valid, only that the identification and seals appeared consistent with legitimate Department of Defense material and deserved proper verification. For a brief second, I saw something I had almost stopped expecting from anyone in the room: professional courage. Rachel knew exactly how dangerous it was to contradict her manager in public, yet she was still willing to risk discomfort to do what was right. Vanessa crushed that courage with astonishing speed. Her face tightened, and she leaned toward Rachel across the counter, with a voice low enough to sound controlled but loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If you touch those documents without my authorization, you will be finished here," she said. Rachel's expression changed. Vanessa continued before she could answer, telling her that she would not merely lose her position at Crestmont National Bank. Vanessa said she knew every branch manager and regional hiring director worth knowing in the state, and if Rachel embarrassed her in front of clients, she would make certain Rachel never worked in banking again. She mentioned Rachel's apartment, her insurance, her father's medical needs, every vulnerable piece of information a manager should have protected rather than weaponized. "You want to play hero?" Vanessa asked. "Go ahead, but understand what it will cost you." Rachel went pale. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I watched her hands begin to tremble as she stepped backward, and I felt a different kind of anger settle into me. Vanessa was not merely cruel when she felt threatened. She was practiced at it. This was not the first employee she had intimidated into silence. The efficiency with which she found Rachel's weakest points told me this behavior had been rehearsed many times before. Rachel retreated toward the filing cabinets behind the teller stations, pressed one hand over her mouth, and turned her face away as tears filled her eyes. Vanessa watched her go with the satisfaction of someone who had restored the natural order of her universe. Then she turned back to me as if she had just proven something important. "You see?" Vanessa said. "This is what happens when people stick their noses into things they don't understand." I looked past her toward Rachel and then back at my sister. "No," I said quietly. "This is what happens when people are afraid of you." Vanessa's expression flickered for the first time, but only for a moment. I told her she was still being given an opportunity to stop. She could call the verification line herself. She could ask another manager to review the documents. She could contact the government liaison information already on file. She could do any one of a dozen professional things before turning a routine transaction into something irreversible. Vanessa leaned closer. "You don't walk into my branch looking like you slept in a truck and tell me how to run it." I felt Ethan's hand tighten around mine again, and I deliberately kept my voice steady. "I am not telling you how to run your branch. I am telling you to verify a government check before you accuse someone of a felony." By then, the dispute had become entertainment. Customers who had been conducting private transactions began drifting closer, first pretending not to stare, and then abandoning the pretense entirely. Phones appeared from pockets and handbags. One woman raised hers chest high and started recording. A man near the consultation rooms whispered something to his wife, and they both turned toward us. Within minutes, Vanessa had exactly what she wanted: an audience. Instead of lowering her voice when she saw the cameras, she raised it. "A felony," she said dramatically. Claire, you walk in here with a $5 million check you cannot possibly explain. Dressed like you've been living out of the back of that rusted truck, and now you're offended because I'm doing my job? I could hear the shift in the crowd as people accepted the story she was handing them. They did not know me. They did not understand the documents. They had no context beyond clothing, posture, and Vanessa's title, and most of them chose the easiest conclusion available. A heavyset man in an expensive but badly fitted navy suit pushed his way toward the front. I would later learn from the police report that his name was Bradley Cass, a regular customer who had spent years trying to earn the kind of VIP treatment Vanessa reserved for people she considered socially useful. His gold watch flashed every time he moved his hands, and he glanced at Vanessa before speaking, making it obvious whose approval he was seeking. "The manager is absolutely right," he announced. "You can tell just by looking at this woman that something is wrong." Several people laughed nervously. Bradley took their reaction as encouragement and pointed toward me. "If she's really military, she's an embarrassment to the uniform, and bringing a kid in here makes it even worse. What is this supposed to be? Some kind of poor single mother sympathy scam?" The instant he pointed at Ethan, everything inside me changed. My son flinched and pressed himself against my leg, grabbing the fabric of my cargo pants with both hands. I could feel him trembling. The anger that came over me was immediate, physical, and almost blinding. But 20 years of discipline existed for moments exactly like that. I did not turn toward Bradley. I did not give the crowd the confrontation they were hoping to capture. I looked straight at Vanessa instead. "Stop this," I said. My voice was quieter now, which made several people closest to us fall silent. "You know exactly what you are doing. Verify the documents and end it." Vanessa folded her arms. I told her again that this was her final opportunity to separate our personal history from her professional responsibility. "Do not let your prejudice make a decision you cannot undo," I said. "There will be consequences you are not prepared for." Vanessa smiled as if I had threatened her with something ridiculous. The people around us had given her confidence she did not deserve. Bradley was nodding beside her. Cameras were recording from every direction. Rachel had been forced into silence. Security guards were moving closer. In Vanessa's mind, every symbol of power in the room belonged to her. She looked down at the $5 million check, picked it up from the counter, and held it high enough for the surrounding customers to see. "You want consequences?" she asked. "Here are your consequences." Before I could move, she gripped the check with both hands and tore it straight through the middle. The sound was surprisingly loud. She tore the halves again, then again, reducing the government check to strips and jagged pieces, while Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Vanessa lifted her hands and released everything at once. White scraps drifted through the refrigerated air of the lobby, landing on the marble, on my boots, and across the front of Ethan's dinosaur backpack. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Vanessa looked almost relieved, as if destroying the paper had somehow destroyed the reality it represented. "That is where people like you belong," she said, looking at the scraps around my feet. Ethan immediately bent down and started gathering them. He moved frantically, picking up one piece after another, as though the damage could be repaired if he worked fast enough. I took him gently by the shoulder and brought him back to his feet. "No," I said softly. "You don't need to fix what she chose to break." His eyes were already wet. "But Mom, that was important." "I know. Can they put it back together?" I looked at Vanessa. "They won't need to." She laughed, but there was a faint uncertainty beneath it now. I could see that my lack of panic was beginning to bother her. Most people would have shouted after watching a multi-million-dollar check destroyed. Most people would have reached for the pieces, threatened lawsuits, or begged for a supervisor. I did none of those things. I simply looked at my sister and said, "You just ended your own career with your own hands." Vanessa's face hardened, and the final restraint inside her seemed to disappear. She grabbed the desk phone, punched in security, and shouted that she had a suspected fraudster refusing to leave the branch. Then she demanded that police be called immediately. The head of branch security responded first. Derek Holt was a broad, heavily built man with a shaved head and the kind of posture that suggested he enjoyed situations where his size gave him an advantage. He pushed through the spectators with two other guards behind him and reached for the handcuffs hanging from his belt before anyone had explained what had actually happened. "Step away from the counter," he ordered. I did not move. "Sir," I said, "my identification and government authorization are directly in front of you. Before you put your hands on me, I strongly recommend you look at them." Derek glanced at the documents for less than a second, and then toward Vanessa. She shook her head. That was apparently all the verification he needed. Hands behind your back, he said. My son is standing beside me. Then, don't make this difficult. I am not making anything difficult. Move him out of the immediate area before you attempt to restrain me. Derek smirked. You don't give orders here. He stepped forward too fast. Ethan instinctively moved behind me, but not far enough. Derek brought the metal cuffs up in a wide, careless motion, and his forearm passed within inches of Ethan's face. My son jerked backwards so sharply that his backpack struck the counter. The handcuffs cut through the air beside his ear. That was the moment my patience ended. I moved before Derek understood I had moved. My left forearm redirected his arm away from Ethan, while I pivoted inside his reach, caught his wrist, and turned my body against the line of his shoulder. There was nothing dramatic about it from my perspective. It was trained mechanics, applied leverage, and the minimum amount of force necessary to stop an immediate threat. Derek's size worked against him. His momentum carried forward while I controlled the joint, and within seconds, one knee hit the marble with a heavy impact. He let out a sharp cry as his wrist twisted behind him. I did not strike him. I did not choke him. I did not injure him beyond what his own resistance created. I simply held him in a position where he could no longer swing a piece of steel anywhere near my child. The entire lobby went silent, and then every phone rose higher. Vanessa seized the moment instantly. There, she screamed. You all saw that. She attacked him. I released Derek the second the threat stopped and stepped backward. He clutched his wrist, while the other guards reached for their batons. Vanessa pointed at me with both hands as though presenting evidence in a courtroom. This is what the military did to her. She's unstable, she has PTSD, she's violent, she's dangerous. Her words came faster and louder as she realized the cameras were still rolling. She walked in here with fraudulent documents and attacked security when we confronted her. Look at her. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent. The cruelty of it landed differently from everything else she had done. My sister had spent years insulting my career, but now she was taking the wounds carried by thousands of service members and turning them into a public accusation of insanity. She was using military service itself as evidence that I could not be trusted. I looked around at the phones pointed toward me and understood exactly what she was trying to create. A short video with no context, a veteran overpowering a security guard while a manager screamed that she was unstable. If that version reached the internet first, truth would have to chase it. I kicked Derek's handcuffs several feet away so no one could reach for them again, then stepped back with both arms loose at my sides. I opened my palms and spread my fingers where every camera could see them. My voice carried across the lobby with a command tone I normally reserved for situations where confusion could get people hurt. Do not come near my son again. The glass partitions seemed to vibrate with the force of it. Then I lowered my volume immediately and kept my hands visible. I wanted every recording in the room to show the same thing. The threat had ended, I had stopped using force, and I was not advancing on anyone. The remaining guards formed a semicircle around us. Two had drawn electronic batons, their blue arcs snapping softly in the artificial quiet of the lobby. They began forcing us backward toward the glass entrance, a step at a time. I kept Ethan behind my body, moving only when necessary, so the guards would not close too tightly around him. Vanessa stood near the counter, watching with a triumphant expression, while Rachel remained several yards away with tears running down her face, visibly horrified by what her manager had allowed to happen. The customers who had spent the previous several minutes recording us said nothing. No one asked Derek why he had swung handcuffs near a child. No one asked why the government documents had never been verified. No one asked why a branch manager had destroyed a check before confirming whether it was legitimate. They simply watched. Ethan pressed his face against my side, his shoulders shaking. I bent slightly and tried to shield him from the camera lenses surrounding us, but he lifted his head and looked around the room. There was dirt on one cheek where he had wiped away tears with the back of his hand. His voice was small, but the silence around us made every word carry. Mom, he asked, you fought to protect people like them, right? I looked down at him and felt something inside my chest tighten. Before I could answer, he glanced toward the adults filming us and asked the question that would stay with me long after every lawsuit, every investigation, and every headline had disappeared. Then, why won't any of them protect you? For the first time that afternoon, I had no immediate answer. I crouched enough to bring my face closer to his and brushed my hand over his hair. You don't need to understand them right now, I said quietly. You only need to remember who you are, I told him. That courage was not measured by how many people stood beside you when standing beside you was easy. sometimes courage meant staying decent in a room where decency had become inconvenient. Ethan nodded. Although I could see he was still trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. I stood again, placed myself between him and the nearest baton, and prepared for the arrival of the police Vanessa had summoned. What none of us inside that lobby knew was that someone else had already arrived in the parking lot. He had flown in expecting a private signing ceremony, congratulations, and the successful conclusion of 6 months of negotiations over a $750 million Department of Defense contract. Instead, as the automatic doors began to slide open behind me, the man whose name sat at the very top of Crestmont National Bank was about to walk into a scene that could destroy everything he had spent his career building. The automatic doors opened behind me, and 4 men in dark suits entered first, each carrying a leather folder stamped with the Crestmont National Bank crest. Jonathan Whitaker followed them. I recognized him immediately. Anyone involved in the negotiations I had spent the last 6 months managing would have. Jonathan was the chairman and chief executive officer of Crestmont National Bank, a man who had personally attended closed-door meetings in Washington because the agreement under discussion was not just another corporate contract. The $750 million Department of Defense Pension Services deal represented one of the largest opportunities the bank had pursued in years, and with Crestmont already struggling through declining investor confidence and a falling stock price, the board considered it essential to the company's future. Jonathan had traveled to Ashford, expecting a private meeting with the Department of Defense representative, authorized to finalize the agreement. He expected attorneys, signatures, perhaps a photograph afterward, and the kind of carefully managed corporate ceremony people like him understood. Instead, he walked into a lobby where armed security guards were surrounding a crying 8-year-old boy and his mother. Jonathan took several steps inside before the scene registered completely. His eyes went first to the crowd of customers holding phones, then to Derek Holt on the floor rubbing his wrist. He saw the electronic batons in the hands of his own security team. He saw Rachel crying behind the counter. Then he noticed the white scraps scattered across the polished marble and followed them until his gaze reached my boots. Finally, he looked at my face. The transformation was immediate. His expression emptied of color, and the leather briefcase in his hand slipped from his fingers and struck the floor hard enough to turn every head in the lobby. Jonathan knew exactly who I was. More importantly, he knew exactly why I was supposed to be there. For 6 months, his legal department had been exchanging secured correspondence with my office. My authorization had been confirmed that morning. Crestmont's executive team knew the $5 million government instrument I was carrying would be processed through the Ashford branch before our larger meeting. Somehow, none of that information had penetrated the wall Vanessa had built around herself. Jonathan stared at the guards one more time and then looked directly at me. "Colonel Dawson," he said, his voice carrying across the marble lobby. "What in God's name is happening here?" The effect of those 2 words was almost physical. Colonel Dawson. Around us, the room seemed to lose its balance. Derek stopped rubbing his wrist. One of the guards lowered his baton without being told. Several customers who had been recording me glanced at their screens, as though the videos they had just made had suddenly become something entirely different. Beside the counter, Vanessa went completely still. I watched her lips part as she tried to reconcile the woman she had spent years calling a failed soldier with the title her own CEO had just used in front of everyone. Vanessa recovered just enough to rush toward Jonathan. "Mr. Whitaker, thank God you're here," she said, forcing a smile onto a face that had gone visibly pale. "We intercepted an attempted fraud." She came in with a suspicious multi-million-dollar check and fake government paperwork, and then she became violent when security tried to remove her. "I was protecting the branch." She spoke rapidly, pointing toward Derek, as though his presence on the floor proved her version of events. "She attacked him. There are witnesses everywhere. I already called the police." Jonathan did not answer her. He walked past Vanessa while she was still talking, and came directly toward Ethan and me. His legal team followed several steps behind, their expressions changing as they noticed my military identification and the authorization documents still sitting untouched on the counter. Jonathan stopped in front of me and lowered his voice. "Colonel, I am profoundly sorry." There was no performance in his face now. He looked angry, but beneath the anger was something stronger: fear. He understood faster than anyone else in that room what the bank had placed at risk. "Were you injured?" he asked. I told him I was not. Then I looked at Ethan. My son was nearly struck with a pair of handcuffs. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He turned toward Derek, then toward the other guards, and ordered every weapon lowered immediately. The batons disappeared almost at once. Only after Ethan was no longer surrounded did Jonathan turn back toward Vanessa. She was still trying to control the narrative. "Mr. Whitaker, with respect, you don't understand what happened before you arrived. Claire is my sister. I know her. She is always." Jonathan cut her off. "You knew she was your sister?" Vanessa hesitated, apparently realizing too late that this detail made her conduct worse, not better. Yes, but that is exactly why I knew something wasn't right. Jonathan stared at her for several seconds, then pointed toward the torn paper across the floor. Did you destroy that check? Vanessa looked down. I believed it was fraudulent. He asked whether she had contacted the government verification number. She said no. He asked whether she had reviewed the authorization documents. Vanessa began explaining that they looked suspicious. Jonathan asked whether anyone in the branch had attempted the formal verification procedure. Rachel's quiet crying was the only answer he needed. Jonathan walked to the counter, picked up one of the authorization sheets, and looked at the official markings. Then he faced the entire lobby. Since apparently no one here understood the significance of what was placed in front of them, I will make it very clear. His voice was controlled, but it carried the force of a man trying not to shout. He identified me as Colonel Claire Dawson, a senior United States Department of Defense representative, with authority over the Federal Pension Services Agreement Cressmont had been negotiating for months. He explained that the $5 million check Vanessa had destroyed was a legitimate government instrument whose arrival had already been confirmed through official channels that morning. Then he said the number that finally broke whatever remained of Vanessa's confidence. Colonel Dawson is the authorized representative whose approval is required for the $750 million Department of Defense contract this bank has spent 6 months pursuing. No one laughed after that. The lobby that had been filled with whispers, insults, camera shutters, and confident accusations became so quiet I could hear the ventilation system above us. Bradley Kessler, who had pointed at Ethan and called him a prop and a scam, began retreating into the crowd. He lowered his phone and turned his face away, suddenly fascinated by something near the entrance. Several other customers did the same. People who had eagerly moved closer when they believed they were watching a poor woman being exposed now moved backward when they realized they had recorded themselves participating in the humiliation of a senior military officer and her child. Their shame did not impress me. Nothing about me had changed in the previous 30 seconds. My clothes were the same. My boots were still scratched. Ethan's backpack was still torn. The only thing that had changed was that a wealthy man had told them I mattered. Vanessa looked as though all the strength had drained from her body. 750 million, she whispered. Jonathan turned toward her. Yes. She shook her head, first slowly and then harder, as if refusing the number could make it disappear. Claire never told me. I nearly laughed at the absurdity of that defense, but there was nothing funny left in the room. You didn't ask, I said. You accused. Vanessa looked at the pieces of the check surrounding my boots, and then at the military ID she had. Mocked only minutes earlier, her knees seemed to weaken. She reached for the counter but missed it, and then she sank onto the marble. What happened next was harder to watch than I expected. Vanessa crawled toward me, no longer concerned about the customers, the employees, her suit, or the phone still recording. She grabbed the fabric near the bottom of my cargo pants and began begging. Claire, please, please, I didn't know. You have to understand, I thought. I pulled my leg back, but she reached again. We're sisters. Please don't do this to me. We're family. Hearing that word from her felt almost unreal. Family had not mattered when Daniel abandoned Ethan, and me and Vanessa blamed me for it. Family had not mattered when she mocked my military career. It had not mattered when she humiliated my son, threatened Rachel, destroyed government property, or ordered Derek to restrain me without verification. Now that consequences had entered the room, suddenly blood was sacred. I looked down at her and discovered that I did not feel what I had imagined I might feel in a moment like this. There was no satisfaction. I did not enjoy seeing my sister on her knees, and I did not feel triumphant because the room finally understood who I was. Mostly, I felt tired. I remembered Vanessa at 9 years old sitting behind me before school, pulling my hair into uneven braids while we argued about who got the bathroom first. I remembered thunderstorms, shared secrets, Christmas mornings, all the ordinary pieces of childhood that make you believe family is permanent. The woman clinging to my clothes had once been part of every definition I had of home. That history did not erase what she had done, but it made the consequences heavier rather than easier. I bent just enough for her to hear me clearly. The Marine Corps taught me to protect people, Vanessa. It taught me responsibility, restraint, and accountability. It did not teach me that cruelty becomes acceptable when the person committing it shares my last name. I removed her hand from my clothing and stepped away. Then I faced Jonathan. I told him that Vanessa could not remain employed by the bank and that Derek could not remain responsible for anyone's safety after using his authority the way he had. I wanted their badges removed immediately, all surveillance footage preserved, and both of them made available to law enforcement when the officers arrived. Jonathan did not argue. He ordered a member of his legal team to secure the video system and instructed another executive to suspend Vanessa and Derek on the spot pending termination and investigation. The police arrived within minutes, red and blue light flashing across the bank's glass frontage and reflecting over the marble walls. They entered, expecting the violent fraud suspect Vanessa had described over the phone. Instead, they found Crestmont's CEO, a room full of witnesses, government credentials laid across the counter, a destroyed federal check on the floor, and security footage already being preserved by corporate counsel. I identified myself and explained what had happened without exaggeration. Derek's attempted restraint, my defensive response, and the movement of the handcuffs near Ethan had all been captured from multiple angles. Rachel, still shaken, gave her account as well. She told officers that I had repeatedly requested verifications seen and that Vanessa had threatened her when she offered to perform it. Jonathan confirmed that the transaction had been legitimate and that his executive office had received advance notification. Vanessa tried one last time to turn the situation around. She insisted she had acted in good faith and said the police call had been based on reasonable suspicion. Then officers reviewed the lobby footage. They watched her refuse the verification procedure. They watched her threaten Rachel. They watched her tear the check apart. They watched Derek move toward my son with the cuffs and watched me release him immediately after neutralizing the threat. Whatever argument Vanessa had hoped to make collapsed under the record she had helped create. By the time she was escorted outside, she was no longer wearing her Crestmont badge. Investigators advised her that she could face charges connected to the false report, destruction of government property, and her role in directing the unlawful confrontation. Derek was escorted out separately, while officers investigated the attempted restraint and the danger he had created for Ethan. The same crowd that had once gathered to watch my humiliation now stood silently as Vanessa and Derek were led past them toward waiting police vehicles. I did not follow them outside. I stayed with Ethan. He had seen enough. By that evening, the videos were everywhere. The people in the lobby had filmed the incident from so many angles that no corporate statement could contain it. Clips showed Vanessa holding the $5 million check above her head before tearing it apart. Another captured Rachel offering to verify my paperwork and being threatened into silence. Multiple recordings showed Derek's handcuffs passing dangerously close to Ethan, my response, and the instant I stepped back with open hands once the threat had ended. Worst of all for Crestmont, several videos preserved Vanessa shouting that military PTSD made me unstable while my son stood crying beside me. The footage spread far beyond Ashford within hours. News outlets picked it up, veterans groups demanded answers, customers began publicly closing accounts. Calls for a boycott spread online, and Crestmont's already vulnerable stock began falling harder as the market reacted to what appeared to be evidence of a much deeper culture problem. Jonathan's office released an apology before sunset. It was not enough. By then, people were no longer asking only what Vanessa had done. They were asking how she had become branch manager. In the first place, how many employees she had intimidated before Rachel, how many customers had been treated differently because of their clothes or income, and why the other employees and guards had followed her without questioning obvious evidence. The story had outgrown my sister. That fact mattered more to me than the headlines calling me a decorated colonel or replaying the moment. Jonathan had revealed the $750 million contract. I knew how news cycles worked. Today I was a symbol. Tomorrow someone else would be. If the attention disappeared without changing anything underneath it, then Ethan's tears would have purchased nothing. Late that night, Pine Hollow no longer felt like the quiet place I had worked so hard to preserve. News vans lined the road outside my house. Reporters stood near the edge of the property, waiting for me to come outside. I turned off most of the lights, closed the curtains, and finally got Ethan into bed after answering the same questions over and over. He wanted to know whether Vanessa hated us. He wanted to know whether Derek was going to come back. He wanted to know whether tearing the check meant the children who needed the money would lose it. I assured him that the funds could be reissued and that none of what happened was his responsibility. Eventually, exhaustion won. When I checked on him later, he was asleep with the dinosaur backpack beside him and one hand wrapped around its damaged strap. I went back to the kitchen and sat alone at the scratched wooden table. My faded jacket hung over the same chair that had once stood between Daniel and me on the night he left. On a shelf near the sink was an old photograph of Vanessa and me as children. We could not have been older than 6 and 9. Vanessa had one arm around my shoulders, and both of us were grinning at the camera with missing front teeth. I held the photograph for a long time, then I placed it face down on the counter. I had spent the afternoon refusing to let strangers humiliate me, yet that simple motion hurt more than watching Vanessa leave the bank without her badge. Consequences are easy to celebrate when the person receiving them is a stranger. They feel different when you can remember what that person looked like before they became someone you needed protection from. The kitchen clock ticked above the stove, while Ethan's question returned to me. You fought to protect people like them, so why won't any of them protect you? I thought about the bank lobby and the dozens of adults who had chosen their cameras over their consciences. Then I considered something even more disturbing. If Jonathan Whitaker had not walked through those doors, if I had been an ordinary veteran without authority, over a $750 million contract, what would have happened? Vanessa's title would have outweighed my word. Derek's uniform would have outweighed my explanation. The crowd's assumptions would have become supporting witnesses. I might have been taken away in handcuffs while Ethan watched. And the first version of the video uploaded to the internet might have defined me before anyone bothered to investigate the truth. That realization changed the meaning of everything that had happened. The problem was no longer Vanessa. She was responsible for her actions, and she would face the consequences. But one cruel branch manager could not create an entire room full of silence by herself. The system around her had rewarded obedience to status and punished anyone who challenged it. Rachel had been the only employee willing to risk anything for the truth, and Vanessa had known exactly how to terrorize her because no structure existed to protect someone who spoke up. Derek had accepted a manager's accusation as permission to ignore evidence. The customers had accepted expensive clothes and a job title as proof of credibility. Even Jonathan's immediate respect for me had depended partly on knowing how much institutional power stood behind my name. I wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee that had gone cold hours earlier and looked toward Ethan's dark hallway. Punishing Vanessa would not be enough. Saving the contract without changing Crestmont would not be enough either. The bank wanted my signature, because I controlled something worth $750 million to them. For the first time that night, I stopped thinking of that fact as protection and began thinking of it as leverage. If Crestmont wanted the Department of Defense's trust, then it would have to earn the trust of the people that contract was supposed to serve. Veterans, military families, widows, children who had already paid more for this country than any balance sheet could measure. I did not know exactly what Jonathan and his board would offer when they came looking for a way out of the crisis, but I knew what my answer would be if they believed they could solve the problem by writing me another large check. 3 days later, a line of black luxury sedans turned off the paved road and began rolling slowly up my gravel driveway. 3 days after the videos from Crestmont National Bank had spread across the country, a convoy of black sedans appeared at the end of my gravel driveway. I watched them from the kitchen window as they rolled slowly past the mailbox and stopped in front of my house, one after another, their polished paint and tinted glass looking almost absurd against the dry grass, weathered porch steps, and old pickup parked beside the shed. Ethan was at school. I had deliberately chosen the meeting time that way. He had already witnessed more adult cruelty than any 8-year-old should have to process, and I had no intention of letting a room full of corporate executives turn our kitchen into another battlefield in front of him. Jonathan Whitaker stepped out of the first car, followed by several members of Crestmont's board and 2 attorneys I recognized from the federal contract negotiations. They looked different outside their natural environment. There were no marble floors beneath their shoes, no assistants waiting with coffee, no security teams opening doors for them. They were simply nervous people in expensive suits, standing on my gravel driveway while the summer heat settled around them. I opened the door before Jonathan reached the porch. He looked tired. The confident executive I had seen in Washington months earlier had been replaced by a man who had spent 3 days watching billions of dollars in corporate value bleed away in real time. "Colonel Dawson," he began, but I stopped him with a slight shake of my head. "Claire is fine in my house." He nodded and followed me inside. The others filed behind him, glancing around at the small living room and cramped kitchen, as if they were entering a place they had only ever seen in documentaries. My ceiling fan clicked every few rotations. The table had scratches Ethan had added over the years with pencils, toy cars, and one failed science project involving glue. I poured coffee from a store-brand can into mismatched mugs, several with chips along the rims, and placed them on the table without apology. No one complained. Jonathan sat across from me while the board members crowded into the remaining chairs. One attorney remained standing because there was nowhere else to sit. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The ticking clock above the stove sounded louder than usual. Finally, Jonathan folded his hands and told me the bank was facing the worst public relations crisis since history. Hundreds of veterans organizations had issued statements condemning Crestmont. Customers were closing accounts. Several state pension groups were reviewing existing relationships. Members of Congress had requested briefings. The board was under pressure from investors, regulators, and employees. Every hour, another video clip resurfaced, showing Vanessa tearing the check, threatening Rachel, or screaming that military PTSD made me dangerous while Ethan cried beside me. Jonathan did not attempt to defend any of it. He simply told me that Crestmont needed a path forward. One of the attorneys opened a leather folder and slid several envelopes across my kitchen table. I looked at them but did not touch them. Jonathan explained that the bank was prepared to compensate Ethan and me for the emotional distress, public humiliation, destruction of the government instrument, and the failures of branch security. The numbers at the inside the envelopes were extraordinary. They were large enough to pay off my house, replace my truck, fund Ethan's education several times over, and leave more money than most families would see in generations. One board member described the offer as an acknowledgement of the harm we had experienced. Another said they hoped it would demonstrate Crestmont's sincere commitment to making things right. Their words were careful, professional, and almost convincing until one of the attorneys placed a second document beside the envelopes. That document told me what they really wanted. They wanted a settlement agreement. They wanted confidentiality. They wanted me to release a statement acknowledging that Vanessa's behavior represented an isolated failure rather than a broader corporate culture. Most importantly, they wanted me to proceed with the $750 million Department of Defense contract without further delay. Jonathan tried to soften the message. He said signing the agreement would protect thousands of Crestmont employees who had nothing to do with what happened in Ashford. He said the bank's collapse would hurt ordinary families and retirement accounts, not only wealthy executives. Those arguments were not entirely wrong, which made the moment more complicated than simply refusing out of anger. I had spent my entire career understanding that decisions made at the top always affect people at the bottom. But there was a difference between protecting innocent employees and protecting the system that had enabled Vanessa. I opened the first envelope. The settlement amount printed inside was more money than Daniel had once insisted I would never see in my lifetime. Years earlier, that number might have represented everything he believed I lacked: status, freedom, proof that I had finally won the argument. Now it looked like nothing more than ink on paper. I closed the envelope and pushed the stack back across the table. "I'm not selling my silence," I said. Jonathan's eyes lowered briefly, but none of them seemed surprised. I told them that firing Vanessa and Derek was necessary, but it was not reform. Vanessa had not built that environment by herself. Employees had watched her humiliate customers and intimidate staff because they believed challenging her was more dangerous than participating. Security had responded to status instead of facts. Customers had been welcomed or ignored based on appearances. Rachel had nearly lost her livelihood because she tried to follow basic verification procedure. A corporation does not develop that kind of instinct in 15 minutes. It develops it over years. One board member tried to assure me that Crestmont was already conducting an internal investigation. I asked who would oversee it. He named the bank's compliance department. "The same internal structure that allowed this to continue?" I asked. He stopped talking. I looked at Jonathan and told him that the incident at Ashford had forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about the contract sitting between us. The Department of Defense was considering entrusting Crestmont with services tied directly to people who had already sacrificed enough: veterans, surviving spouses, wounded service members, and military families. If an exhausted veteran walked into a branch wearing worn boots and carrying paperwork that looked unfamiliar to a teller, I needed to know that person would not be treated as disposable simply because there was no $750 million contract attached to his name. If the only reason I received justice was that Jonathan knew my rank and understood my financial leverage, then the system had proven exactly why it did not deserve the contract in its current form. I reached for the folder I had prepared the night before and placed it in the center of the table. I had spent 2 days speaking with legal counsel, veteran advocates, and federal program specialists, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted demands that could survive after the headlines disappeared. I told Jonathan and the board that if Crestmont wanted my recommendation to move forward with the pension services agreement, the bank would need to accept specific reforms in writing, not press releases, not training videos that employees clicked through once a year, structural changes with deadlines, independent oversight, and measurable consequences. The first requirement was nationwide. Crestmont would establish comprehensive banking support for veterans and active duty military families across every branch, including clearly defined fee relief and dedicated assistance for customers navigating military benefit or pension transactions. The program could not exist only in cities with large bases or only at flagship branches where executives might visit. It had to apply everywhere Crestmont operated. Staff responsible for those accounts would receive actual training in military documentation and federal benefit systems, so a veteran's paperwork would never again be dismissed simply because an employee did not recognize it. The board could design the details with federal compliance teams, but the principle was non-negotiable. Military families would be treated as customers worthy of competent service, not as potential problems until proven otherwise. My second demand addressed the silence that had protected Vanessa. Crestmont would create an independent discrimination and misconduct reporting channel operated outside the bank's normal management structure. Employees like Rachel needed somewhere to report intimidation without the complaint being routed back to the very supervisors they feared. Customers needed the same protection. Reports involving discrimination, retaliation, or abuse of authority would be reviewed by external auditors, not buried inside branch management. I told Jonathan I wanted clear anti-retaliation rules tied to executive accountability. If an employee threatened someone's job for reporting misconduct, there needed to be consequences stronger than a private conversation with human resources. The third condition was an internal review of Vanessa's management network. I did not demand that everyone she had ever hired be fired. Collective punishment would have made me no better than the people I was criticizing. But I required Crestmont to independently examine every supervisor she had promoted, every complaint filed under her tenure, every employee who had been disciplined after challenging her, and every pattern of preferential treatment or customer discrimination connected to her leadership. Anyone found to have participated knowingly in retaliation or abuse needed to be removed from authority. The bank had spent years rewarding performance numbers without asking how those numbers were achieved. That had to end. Then I turned to Rachel Carter. Jonathan already knew what I was going to say. Rachel had been the only employee in the room who had attempted to perform the correct procedure when doing so offered her no personal advantage. She had recognized the documents, offered verification, and stood against her own manager until Vanessa threatened her future and her family's security. I told the board that integrity like that should not be treated as a liability. Crestmont would immediately restore any damage to Rachel's employment record, promote her into a management track position, and fund the professional education she needed to advance. I wanted her to receive a full management scholarship and formal mentorship outside the Ashford chain of command, so no remaining ally of Vanessa could quietly sabotage her career later. The final demand was the one that made my voice tighten. I told them Crestmont would establish a permanent scholarship fund for the children of fallen service members. The fund would be supported annually from corporate profits rather than created as a one-time publicity donation, and its existence would not depend on whether the media still cared about our story. 6 months later, Jonathan asked what I wanted the fund called. For several seconds, I looked toward the hallway where Ethan usually left his shoes in a crooked pile after school. The Ethan Dawson Scholarship Fund, I said, because he is the reason I understood. This cannot end with me. Nobody at the table spoke immediately. I explained that Ethan had asked why people I had spent my life protecting would not protect me when we needed help. I could not give him an answer that day, but I could give him something better over time. I could show him that power did not have to end in revenge. Vanessa had already lost her career. Derek was already facing the consequences of his actions. Destroying Crestmont simply because I had the leverage to do it might have felt satisfying for an afternoon, but it would not protect the next child. Change had to reach people who would never know my name. One of the attorneys asked whether accepting the conditions would guarantee the Department of Defense contract. I told him no. That made several board members visibly uncomfortable. I reminded them that no legitimate federal agreement could be guaranteed over my kitchen table. Crestmont would still have to meet every legal, financial, security, and performance requirement. What I could promise was that I would not recommend disqualification solely because of personal anger if the bank demonstrated genuine reform. They were not buying forgiveness. They were earning the right to remain under consideration. Jonathan leaned back and rubbed one hand across his face. The man looked older than he had 3 days earlier. Then he asked for the documents. We spent the next hour moving through every provision while the legal team marked language, clarified deadlines, and made calls from my front porch. There were objections, but there was no real negotiation over the core demands. Crestmont's stock was collapsing, the public boycott was expanding, and every hour of delay made the institution weaker. More importantly, Jonathan understood that resisting the reforms would confirm the exact accusation destroying the bank's reputation. That leadership cared more about protecting hierarchy than fixing misconduct. Before the meeting ended, he signed the framework himself. The board members followed. His hand trembled slightly as he initialed the final page. When everyone stood to leave, Jonathan paused by the kitchen door. For what it's worth, he said, I should have known what was happening inside my own company before it took this. I believed him. I also believed that regret did not erase responsibility. Then know it now, I said. And don't make people like Rachel carry the cost of telling you the truth. He nodded and walked out to the waiting cars. The gravel driveway became quiet again after the convoy disappeared down the road. I collected the untouched settlement envelopes and returned them to the attorney's folder. Then I stood alone in the kitchen, looking at Jonathan's signature beneath the reforms. I did not feel victorious. Victory was a word I associated with military objectives, with bringing people home, with preventing loss. What I felt instead was something quieter. For the first time since the bank incident, Ethan's question no longer sounded like an accusation I could not answer. I had finally begun building an answer. The following months were messy. Real change always is. Crestmont's investigation uncovered complaints that had been ignored for years, including employees who claimed Vanessa had punished them for questioning preferential treatment toward wealthy clients. Several supervisors were removed from leadership after investigators found evidence of retaliation or discriminatory practices. The new external reporting line produced cases from branches far beyond Ashford, proving the problem had never belonged to one woman alone. Veteran organizations were invited to review Crestmont's proposed military family program, and federal specialists helped train employees on documentation they previously would have treated with suspicion. None of it repaired the humiliation Ethan had experienced. None of it restored my relationship with Vanessa. Reform does not rewind time. It simply makes the next outcome less likely to repeat the last one. I did not speak publicly about Vanessa, beyond confirming that I would cooperate with investigators. Whatever legal consequences came from her actions were no longer mine to control. Family members reached out, some asking whether I could help her, others insisting I had gone too far. I refused every attempt to turn accountability into another family argument. Vanessa had made her decisions in a lobby filled with witnesses and cameras. I had given her multiple opportunities to verify the truth. Blood could explain why the loss hurt. It could not erase responsibility. Ethan changed too, although in ways small enough that other people might not have noticed. For a while, he became suspicious whenever someone stared at us in public. He asked more questions about my work and why I had kept my rank private. I answered what I could, without turning the experience into a lesson every time he was trying to be a child. Most evenings, he still cared more about comics, dinosaurs, and whether we could order fries. That normalcy became precious to me. I wanted the bank incident to become something he remembered, not something that defined him. 3 months after the afternoon Vanessa tore the check apart, Ethan and I drove back to Ashford. I took the same old pickup. I wore the same faded jacket, the same cargo pants, and the same worn combat boots. Ethan carried the same dinosaur backpack with the damaged zipper because he still refused to replace it. The difference became visible the moment we entered Crestmont National Bank. The lobby itself was familiar, but the message it sent had changed. Polished brass plaques, recognizing veterans from every branch of the United States Armed Forces, had been installed along one wall. Near the teller stations, a framed copy of Crestmont's new veteran and military family service commitment hung in a dark wooden case where customers could actually read it rather than buried somewhere. Online, signs explained the independent discrimination reporting process and made clear that retaliation against employees or customers would not be tolerated. Those details might have looked small to someone who had never needed them. To me, they represented pressure points where silence had once lived. The security guard near the entrance greeted us politely and then returned to his work. No exaggerated salute, no performance. I appreciated that more than he could have known. Ethan looked around the lobby, but did not tighten his grip on my hand this time. We walked across the same marble, where he had once tried desperately to gather shredded pieces of a government check. I noticed him glance down at the floor, and for a second I wondered whether the memory was returning as sharply for him as it was for me. Then he looked ahead. Rachel Carter was standing behind the counter. For a moment, I almost did not recognize her. She wore a tailored charcoal suit and a new name badge identifying her as Assistant Branch Manager. The transformation had nothing to do with the clothing. 3 months earlier, I had watched Vanessa reduce her to a terrified young employee crouched against a filing cabinet, convinced that doing the right thing might destroy her future. Now Rachel stood upright behind the same counter, with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that integrity could cost something and still be worth keeping. She saw us and froze. Her hand rose to her mouth, and her eyes filled immediately. She came around the counter before anyone could stop her. "Colonel Dawson," she said, then corrected herself with a small embarrassed laugh. "Claire," I smiled. "Assistant Branch Manager Carter, sounds pretty good." Rachel laughed through her tears. She crouched to Ethan's height and asked whether he still had the dinosaur backpack. He turned it around proudly to show her the drawing, explaining that replacing it would be ridiculous because his friend's dinosaur was one of a kind. Rachel agreed with complete seriousness. When she stood again, she told me about the management scholarship. Her father had cried when he heard. She was taking courses at night while working at the branch, and Jonathan had assigned her a mentor from another region. She also told me she had already used the new reporting system on behalf of an employee at another location who was afraid to challenge a supervisor. "I kept thinking about that day," she said. "About how close I came to staying quiet." I shook my head. "You didn't stay quiet. That's what matters." Rachel looked toward Ethan. "I just wish I had been braver." I understood the feeling, but I also knew courage does not always look the way people imagine. Sometimes courage is not winning the fight. Sometimes it is speaking one sentence when everyone with power expects your silence. Ethan tugged on my hand. "Mom, are we still going to the bookstore?" I looked down at him and smiled. That was the mission. He nodded as if there had never been any doubt. Before we left, he glanced around the lobby again. 3 months earlier, he had asked why nobody was smiling at us. This time, several employees had greeted him, but he did not mention it. He no longer needed their smiles to understand his own value. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the hood of our dusty truck. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat and placed his backpack at his feet. I stood beside the open door for a moment and looked back through the bank's glass entrance. There had been a time when I thought strength meant surviving whatever was put in front of me. The military had taught me endurance, discipline, and the ability to function when fear was present. Motherhood had taught me something different. Surviving cruelty was not enough if you had the power to make sure someone else did not have to survive the same thing. I had possessed enough authority to destroy careers that afternoon, and some careers deserved to end, but revenge had never been the real measure of power. Vanessa had believed power meant standing above other people, deciding whose dignity mattered, threatening anyone beneath her, and surrounding herself with enough status that nobody dared challenge her. The crowd in the lobby had believed power belonged to expensive clothes, titles, and whoever appeared most confident. Derek believed it came from physical size and a pair of handcuffs. They were all wrong. Power mattered most when it became protection. It mattered when Rachel could tell the truth without losing her livelihood. It mattered when a wounded veteran could enter a bank in worn clothes and receive the same respect as the man arriving in a luxury car. It mattered when the child of a fallen service member could open a college acceptance letter years later and discover that money would not stand between them and their future. It mattered when Ethan could walk back into the building where adults had once made him feel ashamed and understand that none of their cruelty had ever defined him. I climbed into the truck and started the engine. The exhaust rattled beneath us exactly as it had 3 months earlier. Ethan looked over at me and asked whether he could get 2 comic books instead of 1 if he used next week's allowance early. I told him that sounded suspiciously like debt financing. He stared at me for a second, decided I was making another boring adult joke, and rolled his eyes. As we pulled out of the Crestmont parking lot, I realized that was the ending I wanted most. Not Vanessa in handcuffs, not Jonathan Whitaker announcing my rank, not headlines, stock prices, apologies, or the stunned faces of people who discovered too late that the woman they had dismissed controlled hundreds of millions of dollars. The part that mattered was sitting beside me, arguing about comic books with a dinosaur backpack at his feet. My son had watched the ugliest kind of power humiliate people. Then he had watched a different kind force the world to become better. And if there was one lesson I hoped he carried long after he forgot the exact amount written on that torn check, it was this. Real power is never proven by how effectively you can crush someone who wronged you. Real power is proven by what you choose to protect once you are finally strong enough to make people listen. If you believe power should be used to protect the innocent instead of feeding revenge, subscribe to the channel and share the story with someone who needs that reminder. And tell me in the comments about a time you had to stand against a system that expected you to stay silent, because change almost always begins the same way. One person deciding that what happened to them will not be allowed to happen to the next person.